U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to deport hundreds of migrants to a high-security prison in El Salvador has triggered accusations of human rights violations, lack of due process, and even a constitutional crisis. So could Trump go even further and deport U.S. citizens as he's threatened to do? And how is his policy shaped by the relationship he has with El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, the self-proclaimed world's coolest dictator who was warmly received in the Oval Office last week? Joining me to discuss this is Jose Olivares, freelance investigative journalist and contributor to DropSite and The Guardian, and Nayna Gupta, policy director at the American Immigration Council. Thank you both. Let me start with you, Jose. You've reported extensively on El Salvador, and President Bukele has been in office for what now, 6 years, since 2019. What do you make of this relationship, this bromance and collaboration and closeness with Donald Trump?
Well, we've seen a significant shift from the relationship that the Biden administration had with Bukele to now the Trump administration. So when Bukele stepped into office in 2019, he entered a country that was ravaged by violence by the gangs in Central America. But very quickly we started to see that there was a reduction in violence in the country. And this was later revealed that it was due to a political pact that he made with MS-13 and other gangs in the country. Now, as part of this deal, Bukele administration officials were entering prisons in El Salvador and meeting with top MS-13 leaders. And during these negotiations, they kind of came to an agreement in which MS-13 could keep some territorial control, some financial incentives were given to them by the Bukele administration. And most importantly, some of the leaders of the Rampla Nacional, of the board of directors of the organization, were released from prison. In exchange, MS-13 agreed to reduce the number of public murders that were taking place in El Salvador. But also what's most significant about this pact is that MS-13 agreed to mobilize their forces in anticipation for the 2021 legislative elections in El Salvador. And they mobilized their forces to vote in favor, to vote for Bukele's political party. Now the pact fell through in 2022. And when the pact fell through, he put in place the state of exception, which has just continued to be pursued in the country. And he started rounding up thousands of people, incarcerating thousands. But what's interesting to note here is that while all this was going on, the Justice Department was pursuing cases against these top leaders of MS-13 for terrorism charges, narco-terrorism charges, racketeering, human smuggling. Now, what we saw days before March 15th, which is when the Alien Enemies Act was invoked, was that the Justice Department dropped charges, dismissed charges against one of these top MS-13 leaders. Now, why was this? Well, this was due to sensitive political negotiations between the Trump administration and the Bukele administration. But it essentially was a gift to Bukele, saying, listen, I'm going to turn over this high-ranking leader of MS-13, who likely knows a lot about the 2019 pact that you made with the gang. And so now that he's not going to be prosecuted, now that he's not going to have his day in court, there's no chance in knowing what exactly this leader knows about the political ties between Bukele and MS-13.
Let's just mention here that Bukele has said that the accusation that he colluded with gangs is what? An obvious lie. He's denied that, right?
He has denied that, absolutely. But again, these allegations are not just coming from random reports. These are coming directly from the Justice Department itself.
Okay, let's talk about, you mentioned the 1798 piece of legislation, that is the Alien Enemies Act. That's a law that gives the U.S. president sweeping powers to deport non-citizens in times of war. It is under this law that hundreds have been deported to El Salvador without due process, because I think that's very important to mention. There's now a legal battle that is going all the way up to the Supreme Court. What do you think of that? And of course, the likelihood of more deportations using this law?
Sure, thanks so much. So first of all, the Alien Enemies Act that you're referencing is a wartime authority. So this is President Trump invoking a wartime authority in a time of peace, claiming that we have an invasion of migrants, and that is a war or battle that justifies the use of this unprecedented authority. The Alien Enemies Act was used in the United States to detain and deport Japanese Americans, Italians during World War II, during a period in our country's history that was known for civil rights violations. And the president is trying to use the same authority intentionally to sidestep the protections of due process offered in the United States Constitution and in our immigration laws. Now, the Supreme Court has not directly weighed in yet on whether or not it's appropriate to invoke the Alien Enemies Act. What they've said is that if you are going to invoke this to disappear people to a foreign prison like the one in El Salvador, there has to be basic due process first. You cannot deport 200 plus men in one day without giving them a fair day in court to refute the allegations being brought against them, even if it's okay to invoke this authority.
So we are seeing the symbiosis between Trump and Bukele, and Trump has bigger plans. He told Bukele, you've got to build 5 more places, to which he responded, that's Bukele, in the affirmative, enthusiastically saying, we've got the space. So the question is El Salvador positioning itself as a host to U.S. overseas detention centers?
I think certainly. And I think this is just continuing the patterns of what we've seen with Bukele since he took office in 2019, right? So when he put in the state of exception in 2022, Bukele himself trampled on due process rights, trampled on human rights in order to detain and round up these supposed terrorists, these supposed gang members into these prisons. And it's exactly what we're seeing the Trump administration do. However, I think it's important to note that there is a bit of a history of the U.S. government acting in this way. Right after the war on terror was launched, we saw these renditions take place around the world in which the U.S. Was collaborating with friendly governments to establish black sites and to detain people who were accused of terrorism, to torture them, to extract information from them. And so this does go back for some time that the U.S. government has engaged in actions like these. So I think it's quite troubling, but I think there is some history to remember here.
But Nayna, have we ever seen this directed at U.S. citizens? I mean, Trump has said that his administration is exploring ways of sending U.S. citizens, not just non-citizens, U.S. citizens to El Salvador. In fact, his exact words were, the homegrowns are next. Are these just words? I mean, many analysts are saying that Trump is doing and does do what he threatens to do. Is this likely to happen? Can it come to fruition?
Right. Well, you know, President Trump likes political theater, and what he's flirting with here is political overreach. He's testing the limits of his authority. He's testing the limits of the United States Constitution by first removing non-citizens in our country. If the Supreme Court does not hold a line when it comes to these removals, if the United States public does not speak up, if members of Congress do not continue to make visits to El Salvador, then yes, it will be a signal to the Trump administration that they can try to remove U.S. citizens with criminal records to foreign prisons where there's a history of torture. Now, right now, United States citizens are not at risk of this. This is empty threats and political theater. But again, if we don't hold the line across our political institutions, we might see this administration make this effort and make this attempt, and then we'll be forced to litigate that and fight against that in our courts as well.
I just want to talk about a specific case, that of Kilmer Abrego Garcia, the Salvadorian man who was first detained in 2019, picked up and accused of being a member of MS-13, just based on his appearance, basically. He was released and allowed to stay in the United States. So last month, imprisoned and deported, again, without due process. He was told that his immigration status has changed. Not only was he sent to El Salvador on deportation, but he was sent to a mega prison, Sicot, without any form of due process. How credible are the allegations against him?
I think it's interesting to note and to look exactly at what the documents that are being put forward by the Department of Homeland Security, what they say about the case. Not only was he accused of being MS-13 by, because of what he was wearing, but there was a confidential informant that spoke out about MS-13 and saying, accusing him of being a member of MS-13 in New York. Kilmer Abrego Garcia, there's no record of him ever living in New York. The evidence is really just not there. But I think what's important to note is that even if he was an MS-13 leader, even if he was someone who murdered or is accused of crimes, whatever the case may be, that really doesn't matter. That's not really what's at play here. What's at play here is the complete lack of due process. even if you are a criminal, even if you are accused of being a terrorist or a gang member, you should still receive and have a day in court where you're able to challenge an expulsion to a different country, to a prison like this horrific prison, the Sicat prison that we're seeing in El Salvador. And just a quick aside, a quick point here. This prison, the Sicat prison that is established, that where all these immigrants have been sent to in El Salvador, this is the prison that the Bukele administration likes to show. They like the propaganda game with this prison. But there are other maximum security, massive prisons in El Salvador that have been accused of horrific human rights abuses. But Sicat is the one where they invite U.S. congressmen into and U.S. senators into to tour, to look at. This is where they invite YouTube influencers, right, to go and tour the prison so that they could see what it's like inside. But the other prisons are horrific, and there have been grave allegations of human rights abuses in the other facilities in El Salvador that just are not seen by the public.
So there's a PR element there,
absolutely,
as well. You touched on this, that Trump's intention is to just test the limits of the law and to find out what citizens can actually tolerate. We do know that on this case in particular, a U.S. judge and the Supreme Court itself has ordered the Trump administration to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia. But that order has gone largely ignored by the Trump administration and Bukele, by the way. But some are calling this a defiance of the U.S. judiciary. I wonder what your thoughts are about the impact of this defiance on the autonomy and credibility of the U.S. judiciary. Are we really starting to enter the era of a constitutional crisis?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that we are amidst a crisis when it comes to our balance of powers and the boundaries of authority that the president has. The Supreme Court has ordered Mr. Kilmar Abrego Garcia to be returned by the United States. And Donald Trump, in a public showing at the White House, has openly defied that order. He has lied to the American public and suggested that it is impossible for him to bring Mr. Kilmar Abrego Garcia home. Now, that is not just the president violating a Supreme Court order. This all started with the president violating an immigration court order that actually prevented the Trump administration from removing him to El Salvador in the first place. In other words, this is the president now violating multiple orders. Now, this past weekend, we saw the Supreme Court rule that the Trump administration could not remove another set of 100 or so men to El Salvador until they had a fair day in court. That is, the Supreme Court stepped in just hours before the president was going to remove a whole nother set of men. This suggests that the Supreme Court understands that they have to be stronger in holding the line so that we don't sink and slip further into a constitutional crisis. In other words, they still have the legitimacy and credibility to hold the line here. And the Trump administration did follow that order this weekend, and we're hopeful that the Supreme Court will continue to act in this manner, that when their orders are violated, they will step in with further orders, that they will be unafraid, if necessary, to hold the president and the executive branch in contempt of court if they violate orders. But I will say the Supreme Court cannot do this on its own. And so what we have seen over the past few weeks in terms of members of Congress, the senator from Maryland going to check in on Kilmar, other members of Congress visiting immigration detention facilities where the Trump administration is staging people for further removals. That public showing, the support we're seeing from union leaders, from bro podcasters, who are all saying, wait a minute, we have a core American principle. We believe in the idea of a fair day in court. Americans understand the idea of innocent until proven guilty. This is a man with no criminal record who had an order that required him not to be sent to El Salvador. And Americans understand that a father like Mr. Abrego Garcia, who's now sitting in a prison with a track record of human rights abuses, has faced a grave injustice. And the president, by taking, playbook moves from Bukele, is overreaching and overstepping and undermining these core principles that we hold dear here in the United States.
Nayna, Gupta, Jose Olivares, thank you both. That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.